Welcome to this week's video on My Hero Academia. This week I'll be discussing events from Season 6, in particular the final few episodes, so it goes without saying that this video will contain spoilers. So if you haven't seen it as yet, by all means go watch another video of mine, or go support some other small content creator on YouTube. Always support your local small content creator, it will do them a power of good. Now on to the main event itself. Now this is going to be my second theory video on My Hero Academia, though to be fair it's not a theory video in the typical sense of it, or what you may be familiar with in terms of videos on YouTube. Now this video is not going to be discussing what Nagant said in a literal sense, but more discussing what she represents within the story. More pointedly, this is going to be about how Lady Nagant should act as a warning to Midoriya, and how she represents a dark alternate future that Midoriya could have quite easily have gone down. So in some regards, consider this to be a sequel video to my last theory video. The reason why I believe these two characters are so linked, and why that Nagant acts as this warning from the future to Midoriya, is due to a concept known in literature and wider pop culture discourse as mirroring. I know that it might be known as different things in different academic fields and in non-academic sources, but I know it as mirroring. The broad strokes of this term is that within a piece of fiction, you will often find two characters who are the opposite of one another on a thematic and conceptual level. The most common example of this within pop culture is with Batman and the Joker. Batman represents law, order and justice, the Joker represents anarchy, disorder and injustice. Of course, mirroring doesn't need to be quite as binary as that. There can be a lot more nuance there. Heroes can be mirrors to one another, villains can be mirrors to one another, and they can also have a range of things in common as well. And a fictional character is not limited to having one mirror character. There might be many, each one of them representing a different part of themselves. And this mirroring can be totally surface level stuff, or it can go far deeper than that. Within My Hero Academia, one could argue that Tomura is not just a mirror to Midoriya, but also a mirror to Eri, though of course this is a whole other discussion for all of a time, so we won't dwell on that particular statement too much here and now. Now, I'm going to be discussing various aspects of these characters, though I will admit that this isn't really supposed to be some kind of exhaustive checklist as to the things they have in common and how they link. It's more of a broader discussion, because I feel that making a list of this will just turn this into a little bit more of a cable TV package kind of deal, which I don't want to do. This is meant to be more of a discussion, though with that said, this video of course will be split up into different chapters, just for your viewing convenience. But with all that said and done, let us get into it by discussing a little bit about the personal history of Lady Nagant. Now, during Nagant's flashback sequence, we get a clear insight as to who she was when she was younger. She's shown to be this wide, bright-eyed young woman filled with hope and optimism, someone who's really enthusiastic about heroism and becoming a hero within her own right. This is obviously something that she's dreamed of ever since she was little, and when we see her in these moments, it's clear that she's over the moon at being able to do what is, let's be honest, her dream job. I feel that the way she's presented in those flashback sequences is a little bit more deliberately designed than just a, here she's happy, now here she is sad, and here's her backstory, woo! I feel that she's designed in a way that's deliberately coded in such a way as to resemble Midoriya, and to make us think back to how he was in the early stages of his story. I feel that both these characters share a similar kind of trajectory with their lives. Similar, not one-to-one, but there are echoes between the two of them. And again, I'm not going to do some kind of great exhausted list, because I don't think that really helps with this particular discussion. But with that said, within Nagant's flashbacks, we see that she was once again this bright-eyed young woman eager to save the world and to save innocent people, and she's over the moon at getting a chance to do so and to use her powers for good. However, she soon discovers that these things aren't quite what she was expecting them to be, and she gets brought in to do some dark and sinister stuff, soon reaching a point where the spark of heroism and enthusiasm for what she does just fades away and becomes totally burnt out, and what remains is this far colder and pain-filled person, eventually reaching this snapping point where, well, we all know what comes next. Like Nagant, Midoriya has always been this bright-eyed soul, this enthusiast for not just heroism but being a hero, someone who finally gets superpowers and thereafter gets a chance to become a hero, though soon ends up discovering that it isn't quite what he was expecting it would be, especially after the events of Season 6. And by the final few episodes, we start to see him going down a darker path. Not one quite as dark as Nagant's, but it could quite easily have gone that way in given time. In my previous video, I discussed how whilst I think that ultimately Midoriya was right to leave UA when he did, I feel that he went about it in the worst way possible. We saw him becoming just worn down most physically and mentally, to the point it felt like he was becoming increasingly vulnerable, to the point where even a basic ambush by All For One would have been enough to see him off, and we started to see him going down a darker path. Midoriya was becoming willing to do things I don't think he would be willing to do in other times. This is best exemplified by his actions and mental state around the time that he was fighting Class 1A. You know, not to undermine the severity of the things that Midoriya was going through at that time, but it's fair to say that he was starting to develop bad habits. Habits I feel that ultimately would have only ended up destroying him in the end. Even if he did defeat the big bad villain at the end of the story, I think that this would have ultimately destroyed him. Maybe not physically, but certainly mentally. Because Midoriya was burning himself out both physically and mentally. By the time we see him fighting Class 1A, the boy that we knew as Midoriya was fading away, and what was taking his place, whilst a force for justice, in my opinion, wasn't necessarily a force for good. He was just becoming this soulless machine, just existing for the sake of defeating villains at any cost to himself, and had that mental state been given time to mature and decay, he would have reached a point where he would have been willing to defeat the villains at any cost, not just to himself, but to the villains themselves, and by extension the world around him. And I feel that Nagant likely went down a similar kind of path. At first, she might have been wide-eyed, enthusiastic, and ready to save the world, but as time goes by, she sees more and more of the true nature of the work she needs to do. She likely was brought in at first to take down targets in a non-lethal way. Shoot to wound, not to kill. Take them in, not take them out. But in time, as the targets got increasingly dangerous, she would have had to take kill shots, either being ordered to do that or having to make that choice herself in a rather painful and distressing way. And each time she would have been told and telling herself that all of this, as grim and horrible as it is in the name of the greater good. And even if she was told to kill people from the off, she would have been told that these guys are the lowest of the low, the most evil people around, absolute scumbags that have to be killed for the greater good, and she would be able to accept that somewhat because of just how evil they're made out to be. But she'd soon discover just how evil these people oftentimes really aren't. Even if it was just some petty gangster with delusions and grandeur whom the authorities are making out is going to become the next All For One, or a group of protesters who are in way over their head who the authorities are making out that are going to do untold terrible things to the world. And as time goes by, those targets' pleading cries for mercy would have just eventually faded away into the background, like a mechanical tone, like the ticking gear in a factory. At first she would have been painfully aware of it, but as time went by, it would have all faded into the background. Now, maybe she could have stepped away from that life. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she was scared that if she did try to step away, she would have been killed to stop any information about these operations leaking, or maybe she was told that she would be there forever, or maybe by the time she realised where she was, it was far too late to turn back. I mean, she wouldn't be the first person to get herself in a situation like that. Or maybe she remained there and kept doing this because she felt she had to, all in the name of justice. And this is a path that Midoriya himself could quite easily have gone down. Granted, it would have been a little bit harder given his quirks aren't inherently lethal by their nature, but he could have done so had the circumstances been right. He could quite easily have been pressed to break that final taboo. Sooner or later he would have found a villain that he can't take down in a non-lethal way, be that All For One or some other villain thereafter. And once that happens, it becomes open season. Killing people becomes less hard. The bigger the threat, the greater personal justification for killing them would be. To borrow a quote from one of the Rambo movies, killing becomes as easy breathing. And even if he didn't want to go down that path, he could quite easily be encouraged to do so. You know that once All For One goes down, the society would start to repair itself, and the need for a hero like Nagant and the things that she was doing would increase as time went by. The more that the authorities want to stamp down on dissent, and the more they want to reunify the nation, the more the need for a hero like that will come about, and Midoriya could quite easily fill that role. Even if he didn't want to kill anyone, even if he didn't kill anyone prior to being approached, he could still be convinced to do so, or at least tricked or forced into doing it. because he'd have seen evil firsthand. He'd have seen true evil firsthand, and that would have been a fact that would be held over him at any kind of opportunity. The soon as the moment that he raises some kind of objections to doing the things that he's doing, he'd have been met by someone saying, well, we don't want another awful one on our hands now, do we? Of course, they reward him by giving him everything he needs, ensuring that his friends and family are well looked after, ensuring that anyone connected with all of this is taken care of in the best possible way, but at the end of the day, you know, as much as he would save the people he cares about and wider society, there wouldn't really be anyone there to save him. And of course, at first it might not believe all the things they ask him to do. Just apprehend them, just take them in, but sooner or later, a villain would come along who is, they're just too powerful. We've tried everything, but we need your power, Midori. We need you to, you're just going to have to do it. You're going to have to take them out. Don't worry, Midori, it's needed for stability. This villain, they're forming this new powerful group that's made up of members of the ex-Meta Liberation Army and those heteromorph cultists, and you know what sickos they can be. This is our only chance of putting them down once and for all. You need to go out and you need to kill that bad guy, Midoriya. Don't worry, it's all for the greater good. And the harsh reality is that chances are Nagant was given a similar kind of speech. I don't think that she ever really had a chance to go down a different path. She would have been eventually brought into this bit by bit, a death by 1,000 cuts, which is something that Midoriya could quite easily have gone down, if not by himself, just bumming about the neighbourhood, going around different parts of the city, taking down villains left and right, and then eventually crossing that final line, or from having to do it because he feels or he's told that there is no other alternative. Nagant, by the time that we see her in the story, is a hero without a spark. She was once like Midoriya in almost every single way, as explained earlier in the video. It feels like they're being very deliberate in how she's designed in those moments, in those flashbacks, before we see what she becomes. She's designed to look like Midoriya, and then by the end of that flashback sequence, she's still looking like Midoriya, but looking like how Midoriya would look in a few episodes' time. As time went by in her personal life, she was ground down, and ground down to the point where she was just this empty husk. Now, maybe she could have stopped herself going that path, maybe she couldn't, but in the end of the day, she might have just done this all because out of a sense of circumstance and a sense of duty. She was just broken down to the point where she stopped being herself. And Midoriya could have himself gone down that path, because without his friends and without a new generation of heroes to follow him, to take up the mantle and to help save the world when he's too weak to do so, he simply would never have been allowed to stop. He would have continued to do this out of a sense of duty and out of a sense of circumstance, all the while being broken down more and more and more until all that remains of him is this ground down husk. And who's to say what could come next? Maybe he could have reached the point where his friends could have got to him before he faded away to nothing. Maybe he could have just been let off and said, right, you defeated All For One, you've defeated the villains, now go off, return to your plough. Or he could have just been locked up in the system forevermore, just becoming this means to an end and eventually going down the same path and making the same fatal decision that Nagant ended up making. Nagant is what happens when a hero like Midoriya loses their spark, when they're so trapped by their sense of duty that they stop being a hero, they stop being a person and just become a means to an end. Midoriya, thankfully, was able to avoid this, because of the thanks to his friends and the people that he saved being there to support him and to show him what being a hero, what truly being a hero really means. They dragged him off that path to make sure he didn't go that way. He was shown kindness, humanity, and a level of understanding that Nagant never got. And he was treated like a human being. And just think about how many villains in this program would never have taken the path in life they did had they been shown that same mercy. He was dragged off a path that would have turned him into not a villain, but not exactly a hero either. A means to an end, and a very bloody end that would have been. Knowingly or not, when Midoriya looked down at Nagant, he wasn't looking at a villain that he'd saved from themselves. He was looking at what he could have become, an echo of a dark future, a road that he couldn't bear to travel down, but one that he was going down all the same, and would never have known it until it was far too late. As the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Nagant is a mirror of Midoriya and a cold warning of what may well have become. We see that in the flashbacks, how she goes from this wide-eyed and optimistic young woman to this broken down and bloody husk. We see an echo of what he could have become in the episodes thereafter. And had it not been for his friends and for the people he saved, they wouldn't have been there to save him. He would have likely ended up like her. Maybe not in the short term, but sooner or later. As all the good, all the hope, and all the optimism, and all the colour would have been drained out of him, and all that would have remained would have been a cold, empty husk, and a tool of justice, and the tool of justice standing where a human once stood. Nagant likely never knew the true extent of what she was going to become. Maybe she was told to kill people from the off, but she was told that they were really bad guys. But as time went by, she soon found that they were less and less evil. But by then there was no way out, and she didn't have anyone to help her. She didn't have anyone to save her. And had Midoriya remained so isolated, he wouldn't have had anyone either. But that's just what I think. Now we're going to start talking about Comment Corner! Now it's time for Comment Corner. These are comments which come from the previous theory video that I did on was Midoriya right to leave UA when he did. Our first comment comes from Big X1 who says, "It's only a theory, a Hall's Variety Pack theory." Oh no! You're gonna be honest, I don't really know how to respond to that, but I will just say... And then I'll say, well, when I do a theory video, it's not quite the same thing. I take more of a thematic dive than it does X mean Y kind of deal, but still, I wouldn't mind that level of success. Our next comment comes from My Name is Quirky, who says, I will say the only thing I don't agree with is that All For One's plan could have been foiled at any moment without gonna suppose that says spoiling anything. When Midoriya, All For One was talking about someone in the manga, it explains All For One has plans that are so intricate and well thought out that nothing is left unaccounted for. Everything that happens leads into his plan, or at least one version of it, regardless. Amazing video. And apologies for getting the comment all back to front. It's the dyslexic goblin poking me in the back of the head and the fact that I've spent a good hour recording this video time and again. But still, thank you for the comment. I can't really talk about stuff that's happened in the manga, so I apologise as far as that's concerned, and I will admit, you know, I put my hands up, I might have ragged on All For One a little bit too much within that video, but the point I was just trying to make is that given the vulnerable state that he was in, if he were a lesser villain and did something just so spectacularly stupid, it would have blown back on him considerably, possibly to the point that it would have ended his grand schemes there and then. So he needed to lay low. He needed to keep out of the way of everything so that he could, you know, make sure he had time to recover. So that he wasn't lured out by Midoriya. That's just, you know, it's just the way that things were. I don't think that, whilst I do think that Midoriya was right to, you know, take the time away from UA that he did, he didn't really know whether or not All For One was going to make this stupid mistake or not. And given everything that they knew of him up until that point, it was clear that he was going to be lured out quite that easily, even if you don't take into consideration the fact that he was waiting for Tomora's body to heal up. But that's a whole other discussion for a whole other time. Thank you all for listening. I know this one might have been a longer one. I really don't know. I have to edit this all together. This, at the time of recording, it's about 25 minutes, but we'll see how this ends up going when I enter it down. Thank you all for listening. Leave a comment down below, like, favourite, subscribe, and all that kind of malarkey. Thank you all for listening, and see you next time. Goodbye! Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, favourite, subscribe, click the bell, and do all the YouTubey stuff that YouTube wants you to do. Go on, it'll do me a power of good. Until next time, my friends, goodbye!